South Africa has been forced to reprioritise spending in the wake of COVID-19, and all this time when rating agencies seem to not be doing us any favours. But perhaps there is a glimmer of hope. South Africa is a member of Brics, and the new development bank set up by the Brics countries may be able to help mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic. To look at how the bank is helping member countries, I'm joined on Skype by the bank's Vice President Leslie Maasdorp. Mr. Maasdorp, thank you so much for joining us. Now, I just spoke to the Deputy Finance Minister. You heard our conversation. He's confirmed that they are in discussions with your bank for a loan to the tune of R1 billion. Can you share with us details of the conditionalities from your perspective to this assistance?
Thank you, Karima, for having me. The context of the conversation that we're having with the South African government is against the background of what we have just approved in China. On the 19th of March, about 12 days ago or so, we approved a $1 billion loan to the government of China, specifically focused on 3 of the provinces that were heavily affected by COVID-19. That's Hebei, Hunan province, as well as Guangdong. And that loan is specifically earmarked for medical supplies, testing kits, protective gear for health workers, ventilators, all of the issues focused on COVID-19. Now, this is significant in the sense that the bank, as you know, Brics, for the new development bank, is about infrastructure, bricks and mortar. You know, we build power stations, and ports and rail and so on. So this is called an emergency assistance program. So what the bank has decided to do is to invoke that clause and to see in which way we can assist our member countries to combat this crisis in the short term. And just to highlight, the loan facility that we're discussing could be up to $1 billion, not R1 billion. That's obviously in the context of the rand depreciation is a significant amount of money.
Now, in terms of you suggesting that this is $1 billion loan potentially, talk to me about the debt servicing conditions, because as you know, South Africa's debt to GDP ratio is ballooning. It's one of the big factors that have led to our downgrade to junk status. What is the New Development Bank's conditions in terms of servicing a potential loan like this?
One of the important aspects about multilateral banks like ourselves, Karima, is that the bank, our bank has a very high credit rating. We are, as you know, investment grade. Categories range from BBB right up to AAA. We are AA plus institution, which means we are one level below the best credit worthiness that you can get. What that means is that our funding cost is very low, which means that we can give a loan at much lower rates of interest than if the government had to borrow themselves. As Dr. Maasdorp, the Deputy Minister, just indicated, the government's total borrowing requirement for this year alone, for example, is R375 billion. So how the government raise that money? They do it through the domestic capital markets by issuing bonds on a regular basis. But the interest they have to pay to those bond investors is considerable, is much higher than the interest that they would be charged if they borrow from us, up to 200 basis points. So to put it simply, up to 2% less would be the rate of interest that we would charge on a loan relative to the government raising that money themselves. So there's therefore an advantage for the government to approach multilateral institutions.
Just tell me, Leslie, in terms of this process with the New Development Bank, give us a timeline when these negotiations will be completed, and what kind of tranches are we looking at? Is this money coming in bulk? Is it one tranche? Is it going to be conditional or specific to, let's say, healthcare? The Deputy Minister kept on talking about fixing the structural fundamentals in the economy, things like our apartheid spatial planning. What kind of time framework is there? But also, more importantly, is this for immediate needs or more long-term needs?
So, as I said, this is part of what we call an emergency assistance program. We will be driven by the demands of the South African government. As a bank, we wouldn't dictate to the South African government what these timeframes ought to be. The government needs to decide what its priorities are, firstly, in managing the public health crisis. As you, in your previous discussion with the Deputy Minister outlined, we have two dimensions here. We've got a public health emergency, and we also have a deep oncoming economic crisis. At the moment, we are focused on the public health emergency, but that is very much short term. So this loan, once it is approved, will be able to disburse very quickly.
Okay,
so
when you...
The bank approved the loan to China on the 19th of March, and next week we will disburse that $1 billion in full, as an example.
So if one is to take that kind of timeline, we could talk about this money being made available in the next 2 weeks or so if discussions are wrapped up speedily.
As I said, it's all dependent on the desire and the needs of the South African government. Post this loan, what is a much more important discussion to have is what would be the targeted economic interventions to stimulate the economy, because that is at the heart of what the government ought to focus on now, given the downgrade which we had about a week ago.
Talking about the downgrade, Leslie, obviously as a financial institution, it must concern you that both Fitch and Moody's have downgraded South Africa to junk status. I know that the Development Bank, in kind of global or geopolitical terms, perhaps looks at South Africa through different eyes than its traditional Western, counterparts. What is your impressions of the downgrade, and what does that mean for investment in South Africa from your perspective as a development financing institution?
I think firstly, it's very important, Karima, to put this in its historical perspective. The downgrade is not a consequence of the last year or 2 years of economic active actions in South Africa. This is a product. It's almost a little bit like watching a car crash in slow motion of economic mismanagement over a period of probably the last decade. As you know, we have had, and this is very well recorded, we've had serious economic mismanagement at a number of state-owned enterprises. We have bailed out loss-making state-owned enterprises. SAA alone, for example, have made losses of over 30 billion over the last 10 years. Just for the next 3 years, to give you these numbers, where the minister has allocated 112 billion that going into Eskom to help Eskom service its debt, right? So this is a product of 10 years. It is not a set of decisions that were taken over the last year or two. In order for us to bounce back, the appropriate question, I guess, for us now to ask is, how do we bounce back to investment grade? Unfortunately, Karima, the news is not good. It takes a very long time to bounce back from a junk status back to investment grade. On average, it can take up to 6-7 years. There are very few instances of countries that have managed to bounce back in sort of 3 years. Ireland is a good example. In 2011, after the 2008 crisis, they were downgraded, and they bounced back again by 2014. South Korea in 1997 was downgraded. They bounced back by 1999. But those are very much exceptions. Brazil, when I arrived in Shanghai in 2015, June, Brazil was still investment grade. In December, just after Minister Nene was fired around the same time, Brazil got downgraded. That's 5 years ago. Brazil is still sub-investment grade today. So we have to take this very serious and look at those actions. And this Deputy Minister correctly drew attention to the structural reforms, the growth-enhancing reforms, the things that we can do within our power to get the economy kick-started again. Unfortunately, we now have a very, very adverse global economic context because of COVID-19. Global economy is going into recession, so that will make it even more difficult for us to bounce back.
Now, given the fact that you've sketched very eloquently how incredibly difficult this will be, leadership and economic policy certainty is, of course, something that institutions such as yourselves will be looking at. 150 economists in the country have asked for a radical shift in the way in which government approaches this. They've talked about the basic income grant, they've spoken about a special COVID-19 grant, they've talked about about extending benefits in the labour market to informal workers. Are these measures that are encouraging, or do you think this is too far off? I am going to be speaking with two of them after the conversation with you, but are these the kinds of measures that you want to see, or are you with the Deputy Minister, Leslie Maasdorp, about dealing with some of the structural underpinnings in the economy?
I think it is correct, Karima, to, as these economists have outlined, to say that all options are now on the table, right? This is going to be a hard path, but I do think that there are some positives that one should draw attention to. Firstly, I think there is, and you can certainly see it now in the response of the government over the since the lockdown, in dealing with, not just since the lockdown, in dealing with the entire COVID-19 crisis. There's strong political will. I think that same political decisiveness is required to deal with the oncoming crisis now. We know what needs to be done. However, we now will need to find new ways of bringing stakeholders together to agree on these paths and drive these reforms. We cannot have long debates now about what the appropriate paths ought to be. We know what some of the basics we have to do: getting proper leadership at the state-owned enterprises, right? Reducing the rising debt burden of the state. There's a number of things that are very clear, and it's clearly outlined in the report of these rating agencies. So I think we have a moment now, a turning point. We can't press the reset, and I think there are a lot of ideas, very useful ideas, contained in that letter to the President from those economists, which the government ought to take seriously.
All right, that's where we will leave it. The Vice President of the New Development Bank, Leslie Maasdorp, speaking there, of course, of that $1 billion that they are putting at the South African government's disposal, that deal to be wrapped up in the next 2 weeks. Still ahead, is it time for the basic income grant and other radical economic measures to deal with COVID-19? On the other side of this, stay with us.